Hello class, I'm Instructor Hollon, and this lecture introduces us to the theory of deontology. We just left utilitarianism over the last couple of weeks, and so now we turn to a new theory. I also want to mention briefly, as a good word of advice, I recommend focusing on learning, as we learn the theories, I recommend focusing on simpler cases and then moving on to more complex cases after we've learned the theories and we're proficient with handling them and applying them. This will make it easier for us to learn the theories, and it will make it easier for us to handle them in discussion with others. And so in our case, it'll make it easier for us to handle them in the discussion forums. So it's just a word of advice. Okay, so let's look at deontology, and we're going to focus on Immanuel Kant's formulation of the theory mainly, and uh, his versions of the categorical imperative, a couple of his versions of the categorical imperative. We'll look at it conceptually. What does that mean? It's a tag phrase in ethics, and we'll look at it and explain it in the lecture. So regarding the name deontology, Cranach explains that it comes from the Greek word deon, meaning duty or obligation. So accordingly, deontology focuses on duties and rules. So in the Greek, deon meaning duty or obligation, and logos meaning the science or study of, deontology would be the study of duties or obligations. So Kant is the most famous advocate of the theory historically, and even to this day probably is one of the world's most influential philosophers. He lived between 1724 and 1804 of the Common Era, and you could find some specific discussion of his views in more detail in Levin 2019, pages 173 to 175, and the Archie and Archie Reader from 2004, pages 151 to 167. So there's some background material I recommend reading for this week's assignments. So Kant recognizes that people may behave morally even if they bring about undesirable consequences. Even if bringing about undesirable consequences may be out of their control. Now notice the contrast right away with utilitarianism that we saw over the last couple of weeks. The focus in ethical judgment is on the consequences of our actions, right? Well, Kant recognized that it seems, anyways, that what makes for the right or the wrong action usually isn't associated with consequences. In some cases, it's clearer that it's not than in others, and so this was a matter of attention in his. This influenced his formulation of his theory in his work in ethics. So, in contrast to utilitarianism, Kant holds that what counts when making moral judgment then is motive or the goodwill. Okay, think of intention, and this is part of some of the criticisms we looked at last week regarding utilitarianism, that the theory doesn't take proper account of the role of intention. Well, in Kant's theory, intention takes center stage. A goodwill is good not because of what it effects or accomplishes, because of its fitness for attaining some proposed end. It is good through its willing alone. That is, good in itself. Hence, an action is moral so long as it follows a good will in accord with or for the sake of a duty or rule. This raises the question how we identify these rules then and duties. So Kant held that we intuit these principles a priori, that is, apart from experience. Um, and he introduces the distinction between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. So a little background on some of the terminology. By intuition, Kant thinks that we have a mental faculty by which we apprehend certain truths. Okay. By analogy, you can think of a faculty in, say, reasoning when we do mathematics or arithmetic. When we're young, we learn the basic truths of arithmetic through repetition, right? But after a while, from doing the exercises, we just come to see that we see that they're true, okay? And some people think that that is their truth is apprehended through ultimately intuition. That's an analogy, and Kant thinks something like that is going on with morality, okay, and that we have a faculty that intuits this, their truth, apprehends, say, that aspect of reality. And by a priori means before, he thinks before really any experience or independent of experience. And what he means by that is we don't check to see if these are right. Okay, we can know they are, again, through intuition. Okay, um, and so he thinks you have to be to have the intuition. So there is some kind of experience there, right? But that's not the ground of how we know they're true. We don't check through empirical investigation or something. We know them through intuition. So that's what he means by a priori. Now, by hypothetical and categorical imperatives, what does he mean? Okay, the distinction there is important for his system. In the first case, hypothetical imperatives are highly individualized and they're based on each person's goals or desires. So if you want to stay dry, then you should wear a raincoat. Think of that, the role of should there. If you want to stay dry, you should wear a raincoat. Well, that's not a moral prescription because you can stay dry in other ways, right? Maybe you don't have to go out in the rain at all. Maybe you can use an umbrella, but it's more a normative statement. It's not quite an ethical statement, and so Kant thinks that hypothetical imperatives will be something like those. But in contrast, moral or categorical imperatives are demanding on all of us. So they're not as individualized to the context. And they introduce this moral dimension. So Dimmock and Fisher list three versions of Kant's formulations of the categorical imperative, and we'll look at each of those. Okay. So the first form at which we look for the categorical imperative states it this way: act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. All right, this is often called the the universalization or universalizability form of the categorical imperative. I'll state it again. Act only according to that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Okay, version 2 of the categorical imperative. So act that you use humanity in your own person as well as in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. And this is often called the humanity formula of the categorical imperative. So I'll state it again. So act that you use humanity in your own person as well as in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. So what he's saying there is treat people as ends in themselves and never as a means to an ends. And you can kind of contrast that with utilitarianism again, that would look to the ends to justify the means, right? Kant's humanity formula of the categorical imperative says the opposite. Always look at people as ends in themselves. And the third version of the categorical imperative is stated in the following way. Every rational being must so act as if he were, through his maxim, always a lawmaking member of the universal kingdom of ends. Every rational being must so act as if he were, through his maxim, always a lawmaking member in the universal kingdom of ends. So for more on these versions of the categorical imperative, see Dimmock and Fisher, 2017, page 35. So by maxim, Kant means a description of an act or a rule. So applying this formulation to a case, we can ask whether it is permissible to lie or make a false promise to get out of some difficulty. So we'll look at that case, and we'll look at how some of the different versions of the categorical imperative handle it. Kant says you cannot will a false lie. You cannot lie to people. That's the case he's looking at. Make a false promise you have no intention of keeping. He says you cannot do that because, according to the first formulation of the categorical imperative, it would lead to a contradiction, a rational contradiction. Okay, so imagine that you asked someone to borrow some money and promised falsely that you would pay them back. Now imagine that everyone in your situation did the same thing. What would the consequence be? Now Kant's not asking about whether or not more people would benefit or not. He's not thinking of the utilitarian consequences. He's thinking of the rational consequences. In this case, everyone would anticipate being lied to when asked to lend out money to someone who promised to pay them back, because we would already all know that people brazenly make false promises all the time. So trust would diminish, okay, overall. Thus, no one could ever actually expect to deceive anyone with a lie, because everyone would already know beforehand that they were being lied to, right? So you couldn't get away with making a false promise then if everyone did this, because then everyone would expect it to be false and wouldn't go along with it. So theoretically, you couldn't even make a false promise and expect to get away with one. Now that leads to a contradiction then for what Kant is saying. Because to get away with lying, you need to you need to somehow presuppose that everyone's telling the truth. To get away, that is, for everyone to be deceived by a false promise, they have to presuppose that everyone is telling the truth, but they already know everyone is lying. So there's this contradiction that arises, and Kant is saying because of that rational inconsistency or contradiction, then you cannot openly make false promises by the universalizability test or form of the categorical imperative. That maxim, what if everyone could make a false promise? Say to borrow money when you need it and you have no intention of paying it back. Well, that maxim fails this rationalization test, the universalizability form of the categorical imperative, so you couldn't do it by way of the categorical imperative, so it would be wrong. So notice how Kant's theory is really very much interested and focused on rationality. Okay, this is a key aspect of his theory, and he wants his theory to basically be applicable to all rational agents. Say whether you believe in maybe supernatural beings or aliens, right, like Star Trek or Star Wars. Kant's thinking he wants morality to apply beyond just human beings, but to rational agents, wherever they are, right? So maybe except God or something on his view, but that's the idea, though, that it's a rational condition, and so it's not just limited to human beings, but it would be more to anything rational, right? So because everyone would expect being lied to then when you make a false promise to pay back money, when you ask to borrow money, we could never get away with making the lie to begin with. So again, the Kant's universalizability um, version of the categorical imperative shows we cannot make false promises brazenly. Okay, so the maxim cannot be universalized without contradiction, and so is not permissible. Now let's look at the second form, the humanity formula of the categorical imperative. This one focuses on people apart from instrumental value. So when we turn to the same question, whether it is permissible to make a false promise, say about borrowing money again, we cannot do so without manipulating the person against their will, since they probably would not loan us money willingly if they knew we were lying to them and had no intention to pay them back. So this violates the condition that we do not use people as a means to an end. And so by the humanity form of the categorical imperative, we cannot condone making a false promise. It contradicts notice how the humanity formula contradicts utilitarianism's focus on outcomes to justify the means. Okay, so in this case, Kant is looking at people as an end in themselves, again, not as means to an ends, whereas utilitarianism will focus on the ends to justify the means. And then, again, I mention that as an important contrast, something to keep in mind when you study the theory, and you can see it in different places really stand out when you learn more about Kant's theory. So, in addition to the assigned reading that I've mentioned, I've included some other multimedia and source material in the Engaging the Materials link in this week's module in the Canvas course, specifically one by O'Neill. And there's a couple of really useful videos in there. So I recommend looking at that material, and definitely read the material listed that I mentioned and also listed in the written lecture. And if you have any questions about deontology, Kant's formulation of the theory, or his formulations of the categorical imperative and how to apply them, feel free to send me an email or ask me a question in discussion forum, or stop in for the virtual office hours over Zoom. I'm happy to give any guidance and to provide any further detail and explanation as needed. So thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.